Thank you everybody for coming tonight. To start us off this evening, our planning board chair is going to officially open the planning board.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to today's kickoff. As was indicated, because we have a quorum of the planning board members here today, and thank you, everyone, for coming. We need to officially open this as a planning board meeting, and we'll also need to close this as a planning board meeting. So we're officially opening the meeting today. I was also asked to give some emergency exit and evacuation notifications. In case of an emergency, there are 3 exits out of the main hall room. There are 2 on each side of this room, to your left and right. The 3rd is out the back of the room. In terms of the men's and women's facilities, there are 2 different sets. One is to my left through the doors to the far side of the room. The other is to the right down the hall. With that being said, we'll turn it over to you, Mr. Gregory.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Jim, for opening the meeting. I want to thank all of you for giving us your time today. Showing up matters, and we take that very seriously. My name is Gregory Curran, and I serve as Smithfield's Director of Planning and Economic Development. Tonight's meeting is the first step in the process for updating our comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan gets updated around every 10 years or so for state law, and ours is nearing its expiration as of October 2027. So this is one of multiple meetings that we will be having that will help inform the development of the comprehensive plan. Before we get into tonight's work, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself a little bit more personally. Many of you, this may be the first time I've had the opportunity to do so in this role and as a community member. I first moved to Smithfield when I was 12. I live here now. Like many of you, I'm raising my family here, and this is where my mother lives, my grandparents, my in-laws, many of my closest friends and their families as well. So tonight, when we're talking about Smithfield's future, that's not an abstract concept for me. It means the place where my children and doors are growing up, where my family has roots, or people that I care about as well are trying to build good lives together. My role tonight is not to persuade or to advocate a particular outcome, it's to listen carefully, to create the conditions for a good conversation, and to help steward this process in a way that carries your input forward accurately and responsibly. I also want to be clear about what tonight is and what it is not. Tonight there will be no votes. Tonight is not about any specific project, any specific parcels or applications for the planning board or department. It's not a meeting where we're going to be choosing solutions. Tonight is about something more foundational. Our lived experience here in Smithfield, the values that experience points to, and the responsibilities we share when decisions involve real choice. And so the evening has 3 parts. First, going to hear a presentation that gives us a shared framework for our discussion and gets us thinking about long-term decision-making and some of the trade-offs that we might have to consider at some point. Second, we'll have a short, tightly focused question and answer period to clarify that framework, to ask the presented questions, not necessarily to be debating local issues or anything like that. And third, most importantly, we'll be shifting to a guided conversation at all our tables. And that's where most of the work of tonight is going to happen. We'll be working at the tables you're currently seated at for the rest of the evening. So if you're sitting with people you already know well, which we are in Smithfield, and I assume most of you know each other to some extent at the very least, if you are sitting with mostly people you know, and you can look around the room and see other tables where maybe you don't know, more or less, most of the people at the table, I encourage you maybe, switch your seat up a little bit and find an opportunity to meet someone new tonight, to hear their lived experience. I think that would be very important. Of course, you don't have to, and most of them probably do have something to be able to do. With that, I am pleased to introduce our guest presenter this evening, Edward Erfurt, the Chief Technical Advisor at Strong House, with over 20 years of experience working with communities on long-term decision-making, development, and stewardship.
Great, thank you, Greg. I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight and inviting me to your community. One of the things I want to start off with, I know visiting communities is really easy to fall in that consultant realm. I am not a consultant. Strong Towns is a member-supported advocacy organization. I'm not here tonight to tell you what to do. I'm going to introduce some ideas to help you think differently about your community through the exercises that you're working on here. Beyond just going to architecture school and working in communities, let me give you a little bit of background of what inspired me to be so inquisitive of our built environment. I grew up in the Midwest, in an area that was identified as a highly prosperous, lots of prosperity in our community because we kept growing. The suburb of Columbus, Ohio, the place I grew up looked like this at the time I was growing up. It felt like every 2 weeks, there was another cornfield, soybean field that was converting into this type of development. Every of my friends that I met were living in places further and further away from where our home was at. Now, my mother is a really avid reader of Southern Living and Better Homes and Gardens. So about every spring or late winter, we would get the magazine, and it would result in where our summer vacations were. And they were places like this. Now, as a child, I didn't really understand why we were going to places like this, but I knew it was important because it's the only reason my parents would lock my sister and I in the back of the car for 10 hours to get to a place like this. As a child, I could recognize it immediately when we arrived because they were always old, there was lots of brick, and there were boxwood hedges everywhere. But learning from these places, when we would arrive, we would drop our car off at the hotel, we would walk to dinner, we would visit different shops, we'd experience this community much different than where we were living. When we would come back to these places every couple of years on another road trip through the Mid-East, or the up East Coast, or through the South, we would go to these places and we revisit and we find that the abandoned buildings would be converted into some active use. The gift shop we really loved, where we found all the great trinkets, were now a restaurant. These places that transformed incrementally over time, much different than the place where I was growing up. So running through construction sites and visiting these types of places got me very curious about our built environment and our human habitat. When I went to school, I paid a lot of money for an education or internship that my parents did to learn about this built environment. And what I learned out of that, I want to share in a really quick slide here. Our human habitat, our built environment, is a complex adaptive system. So let me explain that. My boys are in school, they're young, and they come home and tell me about all the wonderful things they learn about. One of the things they learn a lot about in school are rainforests. A rainforest is a complex adaptive system. So when we look at this slide, we can see literally hundreds of flora and fauna that are in competitive reliance with each other. When we look at this image here, we know that these are places that can deal with the natural climatic changes. So seasonal changes, droughts, wet seasons. My children will tell me it's really important for those old trees to fall over and hit the ground and forest floor because they need to open up for sunshine on the ground for the next batch of trees to grow up. They also need to compost down to compost so that those ferns and mosses can grow. These are systems that are adapting to all of those environmental pieces, and they can sort of change over time. When we go, we take this analogy and we look at not a natural habitat, but a human habitat, we get an image like this. This is that traditional town that my parents would take me to on vacation as a child. When we look at these places, these are places that have lasted the test of time, so they're old. We can see a variety of building types, the variety of uses. When we look at these types of communities, they've lasted the test of time because they've experienced both good times and bad times. They've experienced lots of stress in these different times. So when we look at this place, we can see that if one building was to be removed, or one business would close, the town wouldn't collapse. It would simply adapt to those new conditions. Let me walk through what that history looks like and how that type of place gets built. This is an early vision or early image of Brainerd, Minnesota. For those of you that are not familiar with Strong Towns was founded in Brainerd, Minnesota. This is north of the Twin Cities. At the time of this image, this is the first building being built in Brainerd. This was the end of the rail line. It was a timber area. So these are all folks that are doing part of that timber industry. When we look on the right side, we can see all of those shop fronts, those small wooden shacks. If we look really closely, just behind those wooden walls, many of those buildings are canvas tents. This is where people are coming to the frontier, making small bets in their built environment. They're opening up businesses, they're moving their families up here, hoping for prosperity. When we look at this, we can be very generous in our description of what we see in the foreground. We can call that a street. We can be really generous in that. But frankly, all that's happened here is the trees were removed and the ground was created. You see, these early times, all the small bets are occurring with those new town villagers in the community. Now, over time, on this particular street, those small bets start to pan out. People start to stay, they build on the other side of the street, and we can look at the exact same street in Brainerd, Minnesota, almost 30 years into the future. This is that exact same street. So incrementally over time, Brainerd is adapting to new folks coming in. They're adapting to success. Those small wooden shacks are now beginning to build up. We can also see more permanent materials. As that wealth is developing in this area, on the public side, we can start to see that we can clearly define what is a street. When we see buildings of this size, this is when the water and sewer lines were built in Brainerd, Minnesota. This is when the police department and fire brigade were all being developed. If we were to pan out a little bit further than what this picture shows, one block away you would see those one-story wooden shacks. You'd see the next generation coming in, the next folks moving to the community, incrementally growing out with their small bets. We look at the same street just 30 more years in the future, we can see how dramatically the town has changed through all these small bets. So, not only are the buildings building up, they're actually building enough accumulated wealth to buy multiple lots on the street front. And we can see these buildings being built in more permanent materials. At the same time, when we look in the street, we can see it's paved, we can see the front sidewalks, there's street lights. This is also the time in Brainerd when they built the library and the city hall. So these things are being incrementally growing through the community in each of these cycles. When we look at this time, let's look at Brainerd, Minnesota today, the exact same street. This is Brainerd today. This is a dramatic difference in the development pattern. All of those small bets are now parking lots. Yet, all of the infrastructure, the liabilities continue to be built into this particular image. So the roads are still getting repaved, there's additional utilities that are being added, the police, the fire department are expanding. This is a development pattern we see occurring across all of North America. So what happened from the 1920s to today for us to abandon that traditional development pattern? Well, the moment in time in the 20s in our country was the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, this is when the banks collapsed. As the banks collapsed, the stock market collapsed, the housing market also collapsed. At At this time, the way we finance development is much different than today. What occurred is as people started to lose their jobs, they were unable to refinance their homes. They were unable to pay their mortgages. What happens when there is a flood of housing on the market? Values drop. So many banks were collapsing, so many mortgages were being foreclosed that there was no bottom in the market. This is why the Great Depression rolled on for so many years. The federal governments jumped in and started to stabilize the banking industry. They changed the way that housing and development was funded, but we really didn't see that change in history until what big event that brought us out of the Great Depression. Yes. We're all told in our history books that World War II, we go and nationalize our military, all of our industry, we send millions of men and women off to war, we build the economy back up. Now what's interesting with World War II is in this time frame, by the time we as Americans joined the war, it was pretty clear who was going to win, where the outcome was going to be. So it wasn't a matter of who, it was a matter of when. Back home in Washington, the top thinkers in the economy were quite concerned what would happen when the war ended. Because now we have not really changed anything in the economy of the United States other than the war. We're not going to continue to send more people to war just to keep the economy going. And at the same time, all of those millions of men and women we've sent off overseas to war are now going to come back. They're coming in a different lifestyle. They're all going to need housing. So after World War II, with these fears, all of those changes to our banking systems, changing to our economy, the United States government shifted that war effort to our home front. You see, all of our cities, they understood were economic engines. And the thought was, what if we take that mentality of moving progress and prime the pump in all of our cities? So making investments in the highway trust fund so we could go and have paved roads from one coast to the other. Going out and doing urban renewal projects so we could clear out the blight of our downtowns. We could start to build new things in all of our center cities. Supporting Freddie and Fannie, the VA loans, all of these subsidized mortgage tools so folks could go and buy homes affordably with the easy down payments. All of these things we did as an economy to move things forward with a focus on growth and expansion. I talked at length about that complex adaptive system of the rainforest, but what happens if we shift from complexity to merely complicated? What does that look like in a natural environment when we are trying to focus on productivity and yield? That natural environment looks something much like a cornfield. When we look at that cornfield, there's a lot going on there. When we look at the field itself, we can see all those rows. That spacing is the same spacing that we have in cornfields, whether we're here in the Midwest, out in California. We mechanize how we're able to get wide yields and farm out lots of areas, hundreds of thousands of acres across our country. We also know in this that the farmers and the scientists have come together. They figured it out in all of our different regions. What is the best kernel of corn that can be planted for the highest yield, fastest amount, the sweetest tasting? All of those things are done in this very complicated system to go and yield, to get yield, to go and get as much as we can out of that area over wide, expansive land. Another type of complicated system is a Rube Goldberg machine. So look at this a little bit differently. If we look here, see the boxing glove, it hits the bowling ball. It is all this miraculous stuff only to get to the other side of the screen to pull that small string to turn off the light. This is the most complicated light switch any of you will see. Now what happens in this system if we go and we slide one of those bricks or we cut one of those ropes? And this particular system of breaks, fails. It can't do anything else. So we look at that complex adaptive system of our traditional development pattern, the way that a city like Brainerd grew incrementally over time, and we go and we put our complicated overlay of development patterns, we yield with a development pattern like this. Now, we could call this a lot of different things. It's sprawl, suburban development, you could put whatever name to it, but let's really look at what is going on here in our modern development pattern. When we look at this, the first thing is that the layout of the subdivision is very similar to layouts of subdivisions all across North America. Our planning and zoning rules have just migrated from city to city. If a planner gets a degree in planning here in Rhode Island, they can get a job easily in California. It's the same operating system of how we do land development. When we look at the houses, this is where the builders and the engineers have come together. Our home building today, we can build houses with the least amount of material in the shortest amount of time and the highest energy efficiency. And underlying here are fundamental financial systems. So the developer can get funding for this type of development fairly easily. Any of you that have purchased a home, you know you can go to a bank and in about 30 days get a mortgage for this. The banks can bundle those mortgages and resell them. But when we look at a system like this, what happens if there's a glitch in the system? This doesn't transform or adapt. In our current development patterns, we're opting for maximization of the most amount of stuff at the sacrifice of activity. Let me show you what that growth looks like in a plan. This is Fresno, California. We can see the little dot in the middle of the map, and gradually over time, Fresno, California is growing out. Even during the Great Depression, in that complex adaptive system, we could see that they even saw some growth and expansion there downtown. As we start to come out of World War II and we start to introduce these new ideas in cities, we can start to see how Fresno begins to expand out rapidly across the landscape. We can see this expansive growth, almost explosive across the land, to the point that they hit the boundaries of other cities and could no longer expand out. This type of growth can also be looked at in the way that our infrastructure is developed in our cities. Lafayette, Louisiana is a really interesting community. It's a community that has seen growth like Fresno. The problem is, in their community, they are struggling every year to fill all the obligations within their budget. Paving roads, keeping up on maintenance of their parks, fixing all the water pipes in their community. They struggled as a community to answer the question of why, with all of this growth, are we not able to fulfill all of our obligations and promises in our city. They asked a firm out of Asheville, North Carolina to come in and look at the books and to analyze our maps. The firm is called Urban 3. And when Urban 3 looked at this, they invited strong towns to come in and help tell their story. So when we look at Lafayette, Louisiana, we can see from 1949 to 2015, the city grew in population 3.5 times. I will tell you, as I go around the country, 3.5 times of population growth is things that people get really excited about. That's a lot of growth. That means people want to come to your city. They're not leaving your city. You're attracting businesses, so that's all positive. But we start to look at what it takes to support that population. We can look at things simply like water lines. So in 1949, there was 5 feet of water line for every resident in the city. With all of that expansive growth in 2015, there is over 50 feet of water line to service every resident in their city. We can also look when we do water lines and fire hydrants. Fire hydrants to me are really interesting because they run where they're paved roads. So we can look at where the fire hydrants were going, where they had 2.5 per resident, and now they're at over 50. When we look at this, when the city is growing in population at 3.5 times, yet its liabilities are growing out at 10 and 20 times, this is an unsustainable system. Cities across the country are coming to this realization as they're looking at all of their obligations. Let's look at this at a block level, because I showed you this large city areas, and we talked about pipes, but we could look at an example here. This again is in Greater Minnesota. I want you to focus on these two blocks. They're the exact same size. This is the 1920 expansion of Brainerd. These are where the wooden shacks of the 20s equivalent were built in the city. On the left is a blighted block. You can see these are still the early 20 buildings that were there. They've seen rebasing over time. They've seen tenants change out. I've been out there. It's really interesting what the barbershop sign is. If you look really closely, it's actually bolted over another sign. There was like a thrift store in there. These things change out so quickly that they just kind of stick another sign over because they hope they can make it the 6 months to pay their next rent bill. This was identified as a blighted block. On the right, there was a similar block that looked like that, and the city wanted to go and seek revitalization. So they sought funding, they bulldozed that block, and they landed what in Minnesota is a very exciting fast food restaurant called Taco John's. The best way to describe it is Norwegian Mexican food. But it had the drive-through, and they were able to get all the development standards you could imagine that are on the books, the sidewalks, the stormwater, the lighting, all those improvements. The city rolled out the red carpet for this development because they're very excited about this. One of the measurements that Urban 3 has shared with us as Strong Towns to measure these blocks in productivity terms is to look at a term called value per acre. So we take the assessed value of these blocks, we can divide it by its acreage and give us a measurement that's an apples-to-apples measurement between two blocks. We can see this blighted block, all of the struggle it brings on the city. It is value per acre about $1.1 million per acre. Clearly a blight on the city, so making the investment in the Taco John's. When we look at this, that is not really an investment, it's diminishing returns. With all of the excitement of this new building, with all the investment that's been put to it, what's actually returning out of that is almost half the value of the blighted block that was there previously. This is a pattern that repeats in communities year after year, where we start to put in new projects that have a lesser return than what was there previously. Whether it's a cornfield or a strip shopping mall or a single family house, we see this. This is where I get all of the pushback from communities because they don't trust our development patterns because they've seen this repeat year after year in their communities. The work at Urban 3, they help to visualize this pattern in communities. This is Buffalo, New York. By taking the value per acre of a city like Buffalo, New York, that's seen declining population, we can actually see where the land values are. By doing value per acre, we can see those spikes in the middle, the purples and reds that go up. Those are areas of high productivity. Those are the older buildings that were built in downtown. Those are the existing core downtown neighborhoods where all of the investment and value is. If you drive here to Buffalo, New York today, some of these buildings are abandoned, some of them are a little untidy, but look at their productivity. The areas that are in the greens and yellows are areas that have lesser productivity, lesser value per acre. This is where the new suburbs are. This is where the highway expansions were. This is where all of the current investment is occurring in Buffalo, but we can see where the value is. We can look at this model across the country. We can look at cities in the east and the west. We can look at mountain towns, coastal towns. We continue to see this pattern of where our core downtowns are and where our true value is in all of our communities. Let me take you back to Lafayette, Louisiana. Urban 3 went and did an extra step here. This chart is a little bit different. Not only did they look at the value per acre, where productivity was in their community, where all that value had accumulated, they actually looked at what all the expenses were for those sites. So instead of just value per acre, they're, in this particular diagram, is showing productivity. The areas that are the blue spikes are areas that are producing more tax value than they are consuming in city services. Fixing potholes, maintaining pipes, police service, fire, all of that. They did a very detailed study of this. The areas in red are areas that are consuming more public services than what they're generating in property tax. This is a balance sheet for the city of Lafayette. Now, everybody said, oh yeah, we know we have valuable places, we have areas with very expensive homes, we have new development in Lafayette. We understand this. until Urban 3 showed them where their most valuable neighborhoods were. There were these. Now, these are not the pictures they're showing on their tourism brochures for Lafayette, Louisiana. These are not on the Southern Living magazine pictures that my mom would see that we would go visit. This is where the value is. It's the core downtown. It's the historic neighborhoods and the high ground in the middle of the city. These are the areas in those high spikes of rent. The new subdivisions, the new mall everybody's excited about. What they believed was where their value was not actually there until they did the math. This is not unique to Lafayette, Louisiana. At Strong Towns, we've developed a finance decoder, a way to go and take all of your municipal budgets and input them in to understand the financial position of your city. This is not your budget. Your state requirements require that your budget balances. Every state has all these numbers out. It gets audited every year. But when we go and we look year over year and we look at where your assets are, where your productivity is, we're seeing in cities that their net financial position, the liabilities which they're taking on, roads, water, sewer, all those liabilities, they're not keeping up with the value of the development surrounding that. And again, we can look at this in cities all across North America. If you go to strongtowns.org under Finance Decoder, you can see we have hundreds of cities that have submitted these decoders to help show that you're not alone in the way that we're seeing this type of work. This is the development pattern that we have chosen to do following World War II. At Strong Towns, what we're advocating for is that we need to stop building in ways that make us poor. We need to start looking at the real numbers, looking at our development choices. It's just not about more housing. It's just not about growth. It's about understanding the complexity of our cities. To show you that, this is in Alberta, Canada, up in Medicine Hat. We did some analysis with their city staff. This is really cool. I don't know if we find this in a city here in the States, but these are the exact same platted lots. These are 3 different building types, all on the same street. I know there are people out there that are already freaking out that this is all mixed, but it's an example. This is in the wild. When we look at the value per acre, what's really interesting in this, in these levels of increment of development, on the far right, the single-family home, and the value per acre, so the apples-to-apples comparison is a value per acre of 1.5 million. When you go jump across to the other side, it's over here on the exact same street, the exact same location in downtown, when you have a duplex doesn't mean double the value for the community. What we're seeing in communities is actually 3 and 4 times. It's exponentially greater. And then when you jump and you do crazy things like mixed use or add a second story with other uses, we can see there's higher returns on that. So understanding how this fits in the communities is really important. In the Portage Midtown neighborhood in South Bend, Indiana, South Bend went through a visioning exercise similar to what you all are doing about 6 or 7 years ago. And they had lots of blended neighborhoods and lots of places where people in the community wanted to make investments but didn't know where to start. This is one little corner. You can kind of see the light red line around it, just a small little block. The city went and said they wanted to update their codes. They wanted to go and teach people how to do this type of development. They found somebody that owned some lots. They initially didn't know they owned all those lots. They thought it was one big piece of property, but they saw all those pieces. They wanted to invest in their community by adding in some additional housing and just cleaning up their properties. The city looked at what would happen if they were to fill in that area. So just by allowing, in South Bend, allowing things like rear cottages, by allowing starter homes, and by allowing things like duplexes and even like triplexes or small apartments, what would happen if they could do that in the city? When they talked to the development community, they showed where all the places were that they could fill in this stuff. Where the people say, hey, I want to make an investment. The green line on the bottom is the balance sheet for the city. So the places there are already pipes, already roads, and locals willing to make investments, when they make those investments, that generates over $300,000 of additional tax revenue for the city, with no additional liabilities. Now, this is all getting built out as we speak. You can go and learn a lot about this. In South Bend, they're very proud of it. They're actually ahead of schedule. That build out is 2031. They actually have almost all that built out because they got so excited about this type of development. And when the city started to generate net positive revenue and higher productivity, they were able to help support the education and infill in those areas. So, I shared with you a bunch of really crazy things. I may have challenged some of the thoughts that you have about your own community, but South Bend didn't start out cold with that. I want to share some things that we're seeing strong towns across the country do to begin this. It starts by having a conversation, and I love what you all are doing tonight in this room. In my community, we struggle with communication. We like to do committees. I think we have a committee in our city to tell us when to turn the lights off at City Hall. It's like one of those. There's not a committee we haven't found that we didn't like. But it made it very difficult for anything to get done. Going out and doing a conversation about building in a neighborhood also can be challenging. But in our community, we started doing something called Walks About Nothing. So technically it would be called Walking on It. But the Walks About Nothing is an opportunity where in our community we're meeting every other week for an hour to walk around the downtown. And the beauty of it is it's a walk about nothing, so there's no agenda. People show up. It started out with about 5 people showing up. There are now 50 to 60 people that show up on a Wednesday night when nothing else is happening downtown. And we're learning together about our community, talking about these issues. In Oswego, New York, this is a Rust Belt community where there's a lot of disinvestment. They describe it as having a bank run on confidence. So in their community, people weren't investing in their homes. They weren't painting their homes, they weren't fixing broken windows, porches were kind of decaying off of properties. It wasn't that people didn't have the money to do it, they just didn't have the confidence to make that investment. Oswego Renaissance found a little funding, and they started a property improvement grant. Now this is something that lots of communities do. The first requirement for them is that it had to meet exterior improvements, roofs, landscaping, painting, fixing porches, windows, things like that. The second thing is that they had a little bit of money, so it was a match up to like $1,000. You could spend more or less, but they would only match up to that amount. And the third thing, which is unique that nobody else in the country is doing, is that they required that 7 out of 10 residents on the street had to participate in the grant. Now what happens when neighbors start saying, hey, I'm going to fix up my house. You interested, neighbor, in doing this grant? Or we have a neighbor next door that is a senior that has limited mobility or income. What if we go do $50 worth of landscaping for her? When 7 out of 10 residents on the streets start talking about the investments in their community, they start talking about not what they don't like about their community, but the things they do like about their community. The first year, the investment was about $60,000 in the grant. That resulted in $750,000 of additional improvements that people did in that first round of grants. And this is a program they continue to do, and people compete fiercely for that grant money every year. At local government, one of the things that we can't lose sight of is understanding that we need to lower the bar of entry so folks can get their money off the sidelines so they can make investments in our community. You see, things like commercial buildings and commercial starts, the lowest bar of entry for a commercial start is not that new shop front. It's the transactions occurring, the education occurring under these canopies, under a tent. Up in Muskegon, Michigan, they went to the next level. They actually didn't have any place for people to go and start as entrepreneurs in their downtown. They had bulldozed all of their downtown, much like the images I showed you at Brighton. their economic development department realized that there was an opportunity to create incubator spaces in the downtown to make their downtown more vibrant and active. They went out and bought 17 sheds. This is the public works director out to the shed shop in Village of Town. On the way back, the marketing department rewrote the program so it wasn't a bunch of sheds. They're now chalets. They lined them up on the street. These small 100 square foot piece little buildings are incubator spaces for entrepreneurs in town. A very low risk, they can try things out. There's an enormous amount of turnover in these spaces, and the turnover isn't because of failure. It's because once they get the proof of concept, they're finding other locations in their region to become brick and mortar. When we talk about housing, there are things like backyard cottages. I know in the state you're allowed to do what the planners call ADUs. ADU sounds like an illness or a rash that can get created. This is where the planners got ahead of us. But simple things like backyard cottages, taking someplace on a property that would be a garage or a shed, and just allowing for that cute little building to be built that's a one bedroom or studio to allow for housing. This is the type of stuff that is happening across the country to help that bar entry for housing. Also the idea of a starter home. I've had a couple of hours to drive around your community. This is how most of your community started. This is how my grandfather started his. He started with the starter home, taking a paycheck to the lumberyard every 2 weeks to get the materials to build these. It's not a tiny house, that's a caricature of a house, but just allowing for this type of infill. There's a lot of need for this that can be done incrementally in all the nooks and crannies in all of our communities. When I talk to lots of technical professionals, I tell them that we need to think about innovation, and then they tell me, well, we have public, and public doesn't want us to fail as a city. But what I want you to understand is that we've got a cycle that cities are so adverse to failure, they fail to do nothing just so they don't have to have a risk of failure. But when we think about allowing for innovation, there are so many products that we have out there today that we've learned on the private sector. We wouldn't have iPhones or email if we hadn't allowed for failure to occur and to learn from it. Now, we're not talking about grandiose multi-million-dollar failures. We're talking about opportunities of low risk to do small bets. This is an example of that. This is a crosswalk out in Portland. This is an area where the city was too afraid to try something. So a typical highway project, because that's what they describe this neighborhood street as a highway. We need to go get surveys and do lots of public meetings and lots of engineering and millions of dollars to figure out if this works. A bunch of residents went out with chalk paint and cones from the soccer field. It took about 80 minutes to draw this. They had people from the city that helped them out, so it wasn't just a rogue thing, but they did an experiment at this particular intersection on a Saturday. 3 amazing things happened. The first thing is that cars slowed down on this street because the experience of driver awareness changed from what it was to this. The second thing is people showed up and started crossing the street. Because in this neighborhood, the best restaurant was on the other side of the street of wherever everybody lived. The third thing is people talked about this, they photographed it, and they shared it all around their community. Now, at the end of the day, they took the cones down. It's Portland, so if there's rain in the forecast, all that chalk paint was going to wash away. But all those images, that conversation, shifted the way they talked about this, and the city realized that this little experiment, they could actually make permanent with paint. And if it didn't work with paint, they could try other things to do these small experiments. We can also do this when we talk about transportation and traffic calming. We can go out there and use cones and paint, really temporary things, and experiment if this works. Every time I talk about traffic calming, communities say, oh, the school buses and fire trucks. Get the firefighters to come out and drive around them. What if we made a mistake? Well, we just moved the cones. We experience it in this type of pop-up. When we talk about public engagement, when we do one of these in a community, on your public engagement numbers, I'm not asking you to come out to City Hall. I'm not asking you to take an evening to go do this. All that I'm asking for residents to actually just experience their everyday. So on a street like this, where there's probably 4,000 car trips a day, that's 4,000 experiences that we can go see if it works or doesn't work. And Norman, Oklahoma, everywhere I go, they say that my community is the most complicated and complex community, and we're in a lot of debate. You have never been to Norman, if that's your attitude, because they have a parking code. They have 26 parking categories in their parking code. Sororities and fraternities have 2 different parking rates. I don't know why, but there's something that happened at a sorority party that changed their parking rate. They spent 20 years debating on how they're going to change the table and how much parking they were going to allow for different things. It wasn't until they did something really innovative. They went in their code and said, instead of changing the table, instead of rewriting the entire code, what if we change one word from required to recommended? So we have the ability of the city to kind of control this. We can let a couple projects in that we know that would work. It's only one line in the code text that's changing, so we're not going to upset the sorority event of 1945. We're going to just go and try this out. They did this unanimous support from their council, which is unheard of in the city of Norman. 18 months later, they had 4 projects that came through in their downtown as a result of that single word change. As we look at all of those small bets and we think about our built environment and we're thinking about what you all are working on tonight, what we need to really keep in mind is to think about how we can respond to the way that people use our cities and towns. I will show this to engineers and I'll say, hey, I think we need a sidewalk here. And they'll respond, well, why do you think that? So when we look at these places, there's many of these opportunities in all of our towns as we think through this. Part of the exercise that we like to share at Strong Towns, the thing that all of those projects that I showed you, all of those examples where people are shifting to stronger and more resilient development patterns, started with these 4 steps. They started by simply humbly observing where somebody struggles in their community. Now, there's lots of struggles and lots of problems in our communities, but when we put a problem to struggle, we identify a real issue. That place the sidewalk is missing. The child we have that we wish could move back to our community. The business I want to open but don't know where to begin. When we start to ask those things, we can now, instead of coming up with a solution, we can start to come up with multiple responses. Stage 2 is to actually ask yourself, what is the next smallest thing that we could do? When I talk about that, imagine at your tables, at each of your tables as you're sitting there, and you're talking to each other, you identify a struggle with the people just at your table. There's no lifelines, there's no help out there, just at your table. What are things for each of those struggles that you all could do in the next 48 hours or the next week to help address that struggle? I'm amazed everywhere I go by going through this exercise, how many amazing ideas come out that people have the ability to do quickly at low risk in their community to address these struggles. And at Strong Towns, we are huge cheerleaders for action. So when you identify the things that you have the power to do, go do it. Do them right now. There's no sense in us waiting around if somebody's struggling in our community if we can help provide them aid. And what I found is that we could do this and we can repeat it again and again and again. We have groups across the country called Local Conversations. These are Strong Towns members that are meeting. They're doing incredible work. They start out identifying local struggles. There's a roadway that needs cleaned up. There is a crosswalk that's missing. There's the park bench or the bench at the bus stop that's missing. They're all identifying things that they can actually go out and do quickly to go and respond to those struggles. All of those start to build up the strength and the ability for them to build credibility for the next step. I showed you images of Medicine Hat in Alberta, Canada. What's interesting there is working with their city staff. They have lots of struggles in their community. They started out by doing a simple thing of identifying where some public restrooms were in their downtown. as the first smallest step, as an exercise they could do in 24 hours. That resulted, going forward a year later, the city hall restructured all of their staffing. They balanced their budget. They created a housing policy. They they set a new direction for their city, and it all started with that simple bathroom sign. So these are small steps incrementally growing out. And I want to close with this idea with all of you, because there's lots of places we want to be and where we want to grow up and where we want our cities to go. But strong towns aren't poor. There isn't a perfect community out there. There are lots of great places, but no place is exactly perfect. But all the places that are working towards this, they're built at one small action at a time. And these are actions that all of you have the opportunity to take in this engagement process and in your communities every single day. So I want to thank you. I know we're going to take some questions. If you have additional questions, you can go to strongtowns.org. We have lots of articles. You can sign up for our email list, learn about these other communities. If you have questions that you might not get answered tonight, you can email me at edward@strongtowns.org. I love to talk about this stuff. I love working with communities that are advancing this type of work. So I'm excited to be here tonight and be your kickoff for all of this.
Thank you, Edward. Before we open up the questions, I just want to clarify a couple of things in terms of what's expected of the Q&A. The Q&A is predominantly meant to clarify the framework we just heard, Edward's presentation. It's not for debating a specific project, parcel, or applications. Those issues all matter. There's a time and place for those. And the planning board department will create plenty of space for. But this Q&A, with Edward here tonight, is focused on clarifying that framework that we just heard ahead of going into a separate exercise at all of the tables. With that, anyone have any questions for Edward?
Well, I was condos with noise. More valuable.
Could you just repeat that?
Condominium, are they more valuable? Or taxes than single home?
Condos are kind of a financial structure in a way to get lots of housing, to build apartments. It's a way to build apartments with another financial system. When we look at when you can go and build up as opposed to out, there's more productivity when you go up when you add a second story. When you look at development, if you can, as you can see, just with something simple, a duplex or a rear yard cottage, those are things that actually create more productivity, more housing at an incremental stage. But condos, apartments, they're kind of the same form in different sizes. It's what we see that as a kind of a financial tool to achieve those pieces, not directly to a building technology like a duplex or a house.
One thing I didn't hear you touch upon was that schools, if the community invests in the schools, become the most modern, become the most efficient, we have some of the best teachers, investing in our schools, what kind of effect have you found that that's happened on communities?
Yeah, I think anything we do to give back to our communities that make them stronger are an important piece to it. It's difficult when we talk about schools because the system that is set out for schools is something that the city doesn't have the same control of because of the way school boards and the state structures go. But quality education, providing that flexibility, states all around the country are doing different things with that. But that is, in Florida, they're using their schools as an economic development tool. So they have a kind of far on the realm of schools with their charters where the money follows the students. So a completely different operating system. But what they're finding in their communities is they're using it as an economic development tool to attract people because of that. But yeah, schools are an important piece, and just like you have structures for City Hall, school boards have a structure that I think citizens have to be engaged with and participate in that process.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I heard a lot the word city and the word downtown. Have you, I saw in the presentation comparisons to large cities, Michigan, California. Have you seen this model work in 26,000 population, small town, and smallest state? I don't know how to kind of translate that to what we have here.
Yeah, I apologize, because I know that in this part of the country, you're more sensitive to the terminology of your subject matters. When I'm talking about cities and towns, that is of all scales. So this type of work I did in the local government in a city of 5,000 people. What I'm finding is as we work with communities, the smaller towns and villages are actually more adaptable to these ideas. Because you're able to, and when we look at levels of government. In school, we're always told that the federal government is the top of the pyramid, and then we have state government, and then we have local government. And local government is always described as kind of the allergy of government. But when you're actually in local government, what you realize is where the rubber hits the road is at that most local level. Your elected officials are folks that your kids go to school with, your neighbors, you should church pews on Sunday with. When you show up at council meetings, they can't go and say, oh, we'll fix that once Congress does an act, or once the state does something, at the most local level. So we look at all these approaches. This is something that applies at that most local level. When I go to large cities, and I give this type of talk, and we go through this process, they said, oh, we're so big, we can't do this. What I tell large cities is that where is the level that it can be done is the block and the neighborhood level. Now, when we look at a large metropolis that we shared with some of these places, that's the size, probably a little bit smaller than your community. But yes, this applies at any of these development patterns, at villages and town scale, it all applies. We want to make sure that our communities are fiscally sound and solvent. We want to make sure we're literate on those pieces. But most importantly, what are the things that we can control at the most local level? And there's just quite a bit that we can control once we understand that system and how that operates. So yes, I apologize. If I use city, I am talking about that in the most general terms that capture hamlets, villages, towns, anywhere that there is a grouping of individuals and buildings that are developing out, and the communities that we traditionally are working with in strong towns are usually the ones that are your scale or smaller. Because that's where the real action is happening, because you don't have a choice to go and wait for something else to happen. You have to act now.
In the early part of your presentation, you were talking about valuation. And I did want to make an assumption, but is that strictly property tax valuation of this denying close, or are there other dollar factors?
Yeah, so a lot of the mapping, what we try to do is stick with things that I believe that everyday citizens can grab. The easiest information to find is property assessments. So what has the tax office assessed the property for? That's an equal number that runs across the entire city. So we want to talk apples to apples, that's a starting point. The analysis that Urban 3 has done, they've also put in other evaluations as they have access to things like sales tax. So whatever is generating revenue in your communities, that can also be modeled into it. And what I can tell you is generally, when you look at the assessed value on property, it usually trends with all of the other ways that cities make money. We see the core downtown areas follow that same trend. But it's more complicated to get all that information. So most of the maps I'm showing you is based off of the assessed value. And there's a general agreement in most cities that the assessor set that for everybody as a fact that we can build on. you have to do the math. So what does that mean? When we look at development, what we've found in Strong Towns is that when you look at what it costs to build public infrastructure, pipes, roadways, all of those, whether the developer builds it or whether the municipality builds it, it is always coming back to the municipality to maintain it. So once you get to that maintenance cycle, for every dollar of public money invested, so every dollar invested in roads and pipes, you need approximately $30 to $40 of private investment following that. So if you have $1 million roadway, which is not a very long or wide road, you would need to maintain that forever into the future, about $40 million worth of private investment adjacent to it. That is not what we're seeing in most communities. So when we are looking at those pieces, so when we are, when I go to planning commission meetings, and I've led those groups many times, we go and we look at our land development codes, and we look at what is allowed in the space and the land use. Do we allow housing or shops in this place? Then there are performance standards. We have trees, sidewalks, parking. We look at all of that, and that's where most of the discussion is. There are cities across the country that are actually at the third leg of that school, and they're asking, what is the return on investment for this development? What is the liability for all the roads and pipes when this development comes in? It doesn't pass. So places like Fayette, Texas have gone, they have a worksheet that the developers fill out that is submitted as part of the development review. So when a land plan is reviewed, not only is it right use, right place, not only does it look like the one in our community, but is this going to be a long-term liability that a generation or two are going to have trouble maintaining all of those promises? Because the bigger cities are able to afford all of that kind of analysis, they're also doing this in Orange County, Florida. So around the city of Orlando, the county around that, they're doing it now. They're doing this type of data analysis for all new development. And it looks like a food label. So you look at the back of the nutritional value of all the food you see in the grocery store. They have the same thing that they're attaching to all development. So that better informs our elected leadership and our technical staff of what we are actually obligating to in the future.
And I'll ask you a question that I think a lot of folks are probably curious about. What does all this mean for open space and traditional agricultural land?
Yeah, it means when we look at the value of these places, when we look at these development choices, expanding out and gobbling up all of our most precious land, are we getting a return out of that? So if we're going to give up those pieces, are we getting a return out of it? And if we're not, is that the choice we should be making? The other thing is that we're seeing with a lot of the work with housing and infill development, what happens, I didn't show the slide, but in Windsor, Canada, there's a researcher out there named Sarah Kickelberg. She did this program called AD Search. She did an analysis of Windsor, Canada. So Windsor's not going to expand anymore, but they have a housing crisis. She did an analysis with their zoning code, and right now there are about 70,000 residential units in Windsor, Canada. Lots that all this exists. If you were to go by right today and insert how many places could you do an accessory apartment in a building? How many could you get a rear yard cottage in those areas? She found of the 70,000 units that are there today, you could actually yield out over 50,000 additional housing units in Windsor without adding another pipe or a building. When we think about our development patterns, the suburban development pattern that I showed you, the subdivisions with the winding roads, cul-de-sacs, and garages in front, all of those have been built to a finished state. They're locked in together. In most of those communities, the only expectation of change that those residents have is the trees are going to get bigger and maybe we'll change the color of the front. When we look at the traditional development pattern, these are areas that are adapting and changing incrementally over time. Not all at once. These are places where we see transitions gradually occur, that thickening out. We saw Brainerd, Minnesota, we saw it start out at one story. Over time, it grew up to 2 and 3 stories. So you can begin to see those types of incremental things. None of that happened all at once. None of that was an eyesore when it was built. It was built incrementally. The traditional development pattern allows for that thickening up and allowing for those pieces. The suburban development pattern only can grow by expanding outward, building a nice subdivision. When we understand that, now we have a completely different value of all our natural spaces. We have a completely different value of our agriculture spaces. We realize we can't actually afford all of that expansive growth. It adds additional argument. We don't want to just keep things beautiful. We want to be able to maintain what we have by being fiscally sound.
I had a follow-up to Director Griffith's question. He was asking about what the effect was on the space, in terms of the development. So you answered that it depends on if it was a good return or not. So what does a good return look like? What is your opinion of a good return? Because, I don't know that any good return is destroying open space. So can you just expand on that, please?
No, I would agree with that. I think when we look at cities, they're very complex. And every community has different sensitivities on the land and what is of value to us. What I can tell you from a very scientific way, we can look at return on investment. If this development is going to be built, will it be financially solvent in the future? That's one measure. We can also look at it, is it addressing a need in our community? So these are the sorts of questions, and part of the exercise that I know that you're working on this comp plan is as a community trying to identify and build consensus on these issues. So from a Stormtown's approach, there are many ways to measure it. We aren't measuring it in all of our communities. We're only looking at things at one side many times. Does it look good? Are we growing just to grow? So running the fiscal component to it is helpful. But there's also in our cities many other things that we have values to, that we have sensitivities to, that are unique to each of our communities. That's what makes our communities great. And that is something that from an outside perspective, I couldn't tell you what that is here, but I know that you are on the right path to ask those questions and to build that consensus for your community.
We have time for at least 2 more questions, so if anybody else has questions, just raise your hand.
Just asking your professional opinion, you had the opportunity to drive around the town plan. What do you see some of the weaknesses, if you want to elaborate? I can tell you lack of sidewalks, infrastructure is one of the biggest ones. Not so much control of the building, but it's the way that some of the building is going on. Some of that looks very tranquil and peaceful. Traffic is horrendous, so I don't know if you picked up on anything here that maybe that you want to elaborate on.
Yeah, it's really easy for me as an outsider to go and tell you all the works and wrinkles that you're doing. And it's really not fair. When I talk to communities, what I find to be the most powerful thing, and I think any of you, I know many of you participate in your council meetings or your town meetings, when there's that type of public comment. When I talk to our local conversations and members and they ask me that, I tell them they need to do a different approach when you show up at City Hall. When that opportunity shows up, anytime there's public comment, go up to the microphone and share one thing you love about your community. Some places that's tough, but I saw a lot of really cool places in your community that you would be proud of. When you show up to the microphone for your first public meeting, and you show up the mic and you talk about something you love about your community in great detail. So a lot of communities, you have 2 or 3 minutes and then they pull the mic and you have to step down. But if you go through there and you describe the park that you love in your community, you describe it in detail because of the shade, or there's a place for the dogs to go, or there's a great hot lot that your kids go and really enjoy, a place you like to have a picnic, or there's some serenity. When you talk about that in detail for 2 to 3 minutes with the public, the first thing that happens is the room goes completely silent. Because nobody hears that in council meetings. They hear all the complaints and all the things that are not good and all the negativities, and where do we start? The other thing that happens is after the meeting, people will come up to you and say, I love that place too. Do you know there's this in that location? Now you're building consensus, you're building relationships with people in your community that right now, and all of our local governments and all of our communities are really struggling. So you're building that up. The other thing that miraculously starts to occur is that when other projects come forward, staff and elected officials start talking about that project in relation to the things that you talked about that you like in your community. So it is now being measured on the things that you like or don't. So we're not talking about bad traffic, we're talking about the streets we love in our community. And when the new highway project comes in, is that going to be like the street we all like? Or is that going to be more of the same that we don't? And we can empower our elected officials and technical staff in our communities with that type of work. It's a tough exercise, but it's a really important one. And what I'm finding is that next small step that a lot of people are doing. How do I get involved in my local government? You show up to the local meetings, you participate in these events. What's the next thing? You stand up and you share the things you like about your community. You talk about it in those ways. That positivity will rise above anything else. So I'm kind of throwing the question back to you, but that's the approach that I would do. The struggles that I saw around your community are struggles that cities all across North America are facing. They're not unique to you. But there's also places that are overcoming that. And you have lots of examples here. Your town is old enough, your community has enough age that this town has seen generations. So there's a lot to learn here. Just like I showed the pictures of Brainerd, there's probably a picture set like that for your community that walks through those pieces. And there is probably a moment in time where that completely changed. And what I will tell you is that change is an outside force. When we come back and return to the most local level, we can actually overcome.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on generational balance, working across generations. We have an aging population, and we, of course, have new families and babies born every day. I think there's always that inclination for the older generation to think that the younger generation doesn't care and is apathetic. And, then we have that balance between whether or not you still have kids in schools and that kind of thing. But just trying to look at some of the pictures you were showing, and it's really nice to see generations working together in the community. Just want your thoughts on how maybe that works and how we can see that happen more.
Yeah. It's understanding all of the stages of life. What's interesting right now is AARP, when they have looked at their members, there are two things that they are struggling with that add to this conversation. The first is they're fighting an AARP membership is that they're fighting a loneliness epidemic. So seniors are living alone in their homes. They're not as mobile. They're not able to get around. The other thing that they are seeing with members as a struggle is housing security. So not affordability, they have a big house, but now they need to downsize. Where's the only place for them to go? They have to go 30 miles away. That's not in their community. They're not able to age in place. In places like Wisconsin, AARP is actually teaching the next generation of incremental developers. They're funding that so people can learn how to build rear cottages, accessory apartments, and do that type of work today. It costs nothing for folks to get that education. And what's happening is that the incremental developers, the folks that are doing that type of work, are engaging seniors that have the resources at this point to go and add accessory apartments, to add rear cottages so they can age in place. They may be today renting out the back cottage to somebody that helps with the loneliness epidemic. It provides additional income, so stabilizes their housing and security. Over time, they're changing where they're living by moving into the smaller place with the down master that's accessible, that's smaller and more manageable, and renting out a larger home. Again, helping that capital, because at that time the roof needs to be replaced, the heater needs to be replaced, they're getting rent, they're seeing a new family move into the neighborhood. So there's lots of partners out there. AARP is a great resource because they do incredible stuff in Wisconsin and other cities, and they share the struggle. When I look at community groups, there's another group of individuals that I'm getting introduced to almost every week. These are folks that are in high school or just graduated high school now. I don't know which letter or generation they are, but they are super hyped up about urban design and the built environment. They're calling Strong Towns because they're doing presentations, they're doing crash analysis studios, they're doing things that it's difficult for professionals to do, but they're getting hyped up on that stuff. So there is a group of younger folks that love these types of things. They want to be engaged on that. And again, bringing them to the table, helping them work through that. We're seeing all different types of things happen with that just by allowing a platform for those conversations to occur.
Please join me in thanking Edward once more.
The purpose of that presentation was to give us shared context, new thoughts, new ideas to chew on as we move into the next exercise. So the rest of the evening, our focus is on Smithfield, our experiences, our values, and responsibilities we believe we share. So I'd like to ask that one person at each table open the packet. One person will be the person who records group responses.
There are worksheets in each of those packets. They will guide the conversation. They're designed so that everyone has a chance to speak and a chance to listen with attention. So if you turn to worksheet 1, we'll do it together. So the first exercise focuses on experience, not opinions. There's nothing to solve here. There's no way answers. The goal is simply to listen and notice what matters to other people. The instructions are on the worksheet. Please keep the conversation at your own table. And please remember to let one person next to you. Each of you will have 2 minutes to answer the question on the page. The other person's job is to listen, and then we'll switch. Sounds like you're all ahead of me, so go for it. So assuming that most of you have gone through step one and are starting to work on step two, I attest that you pause at step three, you've done with step two. And just to be clear, one person will be capturing the notes, the stories that you heard from one another, but it's to transcribe your values. What does that, you should ask yourself, what do those stories say that we care about? How does that story about an experience that impacts somewhere or someplace in town transcribe to a value? based on what you've written, what you've captured, your value statements, who do these responsibilities seem to point toward? Ask yourself why. Check. Whichever boxes stand out to you as a table, you don't need to necessarily agree on them, but which will stand out to you all at your table. Check them in. There are those who came before us, well, that's actually correct. That's the old version. Step 3 on the bottom of exercise 1, worksheet 1. So that's those who came before us, our history and character, future residents, our kids, people who live here now, the land, water, and natural systems.
Can you put that? I think that was.
We're going to move on now to the take of time and going. We're going to move on to the second sheet. We're going to build on everything that was previously discussed. From the value statements that you're able to grow, choose the two that you feel most important when decisions get particularly hard. This isn't a ranking exercise, it's not a voting exercise. Just choose two of those which you think should carry the most weight when under pressure. When that value is under pressure. maybe specific. When trade-offs are unavoidable, the town should generally fill in the blank. Or each of the two value statements that you have chosen in step 2. Step 1. Just as an example, values, fiscal responsibility, the question was about how should that value have decisions with something people want, also creates long-term costs. Or the value is protecting neighborhoods. The decision filter might be the answer, what should the town generally do to protect the neighborhood character from other needs like housing, services, or economic activity?
Are responsible.
You can pick however many you want. You don't need to pick one. You could pick one, you could pick all of them. You could pick none. These exercises are very subjective. How all of you at all of your tables feel about them.
So these go back in the packet, and then you look at it, what did that guy do?
This is different than those conversations he was referring to.
was very clear, and I want to make sure I can say it to everybody. And I'm going to walk around the room, and we'll wrap up in just shy of 15 minutes before we close out. And I explain to you what the next steps are going to be. So, for each decision filter that you wrote or landed on at the table, there's a last question on the worksheet, which is name one situation where following the rule, the guidelines, policies, however you landed, might feel difficult, uncomfortable, or even controversial. Now, this is a stress test. We're asking the town to really use the principle. When and where would it get hard at some point? And this is why I think this whole exercise matters a great deal for the comprehensive plan, because comprehensive plans are built around goals, policies, and actions. Those goals, policies, and actions do not always point neatly in the same direction. And so the goal of this isn't to weaken the role of our values. It's to understand what it would actually ask of us when taken seriously, like our goals, policies, and actions, and our comprehensive plan. A plan may say we value open space, housing choice, fiscal responsibility, safe streets, strong neighborhoods. But in real decisions, sometimes they can pull in those different directions. And that's often the hardest part about planning as a practitioner, as a planning board member, as a town council member. Is when we're reviewing applications, ordinance amendments, zone changes, or deciding how the town should grow or invest over time. As we've heard tonight, strong communities are not necessarily built by pretending those tensions don't exist. They're built by looking honestly at those trade-offs, listening carefully where we see struggle or opportunity, and making decisions to help the community become stronger and more resilient over time. So with that, if you have any questions as I move around the room, or if there's any questions, feel free to ask me as I move around. But I just want to make sure that the last piece of the exercise was clear and very pointed, just to understand the whole purpose of the exercise as a whole. That we'll spend another 10 minutes or so discussing that, but I think I've previous ones, and then we'll close it out at 8:30.
Every
this exercise, they're not just going to go into this binder and go away. I'm going to be reviewing all of them, everything that you wrote down and shared. All that's going to be summarized and shared publicly with all of you and all the other residents in town. And of course, it will be brought to the planning board. I'll present on it at one of the next couple of planning board meetings for what I heard from all of you today. So that everything that's been reported can become a part of the comprehensive plan as a whole, part of that process. The values and decisions statements from tonight will help guide the next phase of the plan. It can help us think about what data we look at, how we look at that data, what questions we ask, and how future choices and trade-offs are evaluated. You will see some of this language again as the process moves forward. You will have opportunities to react, how it's being used, refine it, help us make sure that it reflects Smithfield honestly. So before we leave, I just ask that we put all the worksheets back in the envelope, so I can collect them afterwards. You can either leave them on the table or place them in that bin on your way out. One more thing, you can scan the QR code. There's two QR codes floating around a lot of materials. I place one will bring you to a form which you can sign up, give me your email address, so you can get updates on the process as it moves forward. The other one is a survey that launches exactly right now. So it's now available. So when you get home, you can fill out the survey. Other folks can fill out the survey. It builds on everything that we talked about today. You'll see some questions that are pretty similar. That way, other residents who weren't here tonight can respond similarly to some of the things that we're asking you tonight. But it won't be wholly redundant. There are most of the questions that are on that survey build on what we worked on and discussed tonight. So with that, I thank you again for your time.
I just want to make one quick comment. This was a brainstorm of great planning director, and when he came to me, I said, he must be crazy. He set all this up with his staff. I think this was really productive, and I can collect good information. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
As a member of the planning board, this is the official planning board meeting. And again, I'd like to thank Director Burdick for putting together a very thoughtful presentation today, a workshop, got everybody speaking. Also, I'd like to mention that at all the planning board meetings, we open up the matter for public comment, so to the extent any members of the public would like to make a public comment about anything to do with planning, the comprehensive plan, more than welcome to do so. That being said, do we have a motion? Do we have a second? All in favor? Aye. All not in favor? The ayes have it.